G'day guys, and today I'm here to report, sadly, that the Australian government continues to be a bunch of censorship-loving jackasses. So just yesterday, the 6th of March, the Australian government rejected Milo Yiannopoulus' application for a visa to enter Australia. Why, you may ask? Well, he was rejected on character grounds. Now what exactly does that mean? So we've actually got an excerpt from the letter the Immigration Department sent to Milo, describing its reasoning behind why it is essentially banning him from coming to Australia. So there is a risk that, quote, Milo would incite discord in the Australian community or in a segment of that community. And they mentioned specifically the protests that happened during his last visit to Australia in 2017. So quoting again, despite the locations of your previous appearance being withheld by the organisers until 24 hours prior to the event, this is of course make it harder for people to picket and protest and start a huge fight essentially, there were significant protests at both the Sydney and Melbourne events. Now, that doesn't particularly strike me as Milo's fault per se, and isn't that the fault of people who are showing up to protest or showing up to be violent? He doesn't specifically mention whether these protesters were violent or not, but if it's enough to warrant a problem, I don't see how this is Milo's fault. He's just coming here to say something, and if people want to get violent, that's on them. But you see, it's an interesting thing, and this is always the case with censorship, and Stefan Molyneux did a really good short video on this when he was in Australia. When you have a group that is being violent and a group that is not being violent, it's far easier to police the group that isn't being violent. So what happened in Stefan's video is that he approached a man who was protesting something to do with the Indigenous Australians, and he tried to talk to that man, and the man screamed and shouted and swore in his face, and eventually the police came up and told Molyneux to move on. So you can see, you're not going to attempt to tackle the person who's, getting up in people's face and swearing and things like that. It's so much easier, so much safer just to attack the peaceful person. So here's another interesting tidbit. Turns out Milo was actually charged a bill of $50,000 by Victoria Police for the cost of policing his event when he was here. So that's interesting, I didn't actually know that, and the same thing happened to Stefan and Lauren Southern when they were here. So Milo was hit with that bill after a riot broke out at the entrance. Again, I don't see how that's Milo's fault. If people show up to be violent, then that's on them. They have the freedom to choose not to be there, not to be violent, and if they're going to start fighting people, that's their fault. I don't see why Milo should be charged for police protection. Well, that's not true. I do see why he is charged for it. It's to make the bar to free speech way too high. I can't afford a $50,000 police protection fee. Hardly anyone can. So essentially this is shutting people out of the free speech game. I'll just take a second to read out Pauline Hanson's response to this. It hits the nail on the head pretty well. I'm sad to say that the government is now acting as an arm of Antifa. Milo and Tommy Robinson have not called for violence. They have been the victims of violence. By refusing them entry into Australia, this gutless government is validating the left's use of violence to silence people. And yeah, if you think about incentivizing people, you've just shown Antifa that, yeah, if you get violent, they'll ban people that they don't like. This is only incentivizing, it's sending up a big red flare to everyone who wants to use violence to silence people that, yeah, you can totally do that and get away with it. This isn't how you stop violence. Letting people speak is how you stop violence. There's only two ways to discuss a problem in society, with words or with fists. And the more people talk, the less they hit each other. Another thing of note is that Pauline Hanson was actually speaking to the Immigration Minister, David Coleman, on Milo's behalf in the lead up to this decision, and she says that she was being glossed over, kept at bay, thrown tidbits, and the dude was sliding around the question essentially. As I alluded to at the start of this video, this isn't the first time Australia has banned certain speakers from coming into the country. So just last year, December, Gavin McInnes was banned from entering Australia, and I know that Lauren Southern had a wee bit of trouble getting into country when she was last here as well. This is bloody disgraceful. This is the government treating us with kid gloves, saying we're too stupid to work out what we should think for ourselves, and it doesn't even work anyway. I don't know why they would do this. Is it a virtue signaling thing? Are they just worried that people would look at them and say, hey, they let them do this? Because it doesn't really matter if you don't let them enter the country to speak. It's not the 1900s anymore. The internet exists, and anyone in Australia can just boot up YouTube, Facebook, Gab, Minds, Bitchute, anywhere they want to go, and essentially look up Tommy Robinson, and they can get everything they need to see there. In light of this, I would hazard a guess that this is actually a virtue signaling PR move for the Liberal Party coming up to the next election, because you can imagine the talking points, false inflated talking points that would be generated if Milo and Gavin and whoever, Tommy Robinson, was allowed to come here and speak, because Labour would come out in a close election, mind you, and say, look, they're platforming all these hateful people, we won't do that, etc., etc. And unfortunately, propaganda seems to work in Australia. Australia is it's very strange. Australia is a couple of years behind the rest of the world culturally, so we haven't really picked up on this whole free speech debate yet. Basically because it isn't an issue in our constitution. Australians have no right to speak freely. There's an implied right to political speech, but it's only through the interpretation of a court. It's not literal. It's because we live in a democracy, we should be able to pick our leaders, therefore we should be able to speak about our leaders. But it's not set in stone. It's no First Amendment, no right to free speech in Australia. Eventually this will pick up, and I hope this will be pointed to as a potent example of essentially Australia's embarrassing past. It is medieval that we do not invite everyone to come to our country and speak what they say. If you're worried about what people say, you're worried about them peddling stuff. When Milo came here, he was in a Q&A session in Parliament House with Liberal Democrat Senator David Leyonhjelm, and he suggested everyone should read Mein Kampf, saying that, quote, people should read the very, very worst as well as the very, very best that has been thought and written. And of course, that's, I read that from a news article, so that's being used as a point as to why he shouldn't have been let to Australia, because, he's suggesting people should read Mein Kampf and, stuff like that. But to me, this isn't really an issue, and I just apply a little logic here, and I'm seeing if you can follow along with what I'm saying. So, picture yourself as someone who doesn't like Milo Yiannopoulus. You think he's wrong, what he says is wrong and idiotic and stupid, but most of all, it's wrong. He is incorrect about what he says. Well then, you should be able to prove that, right? You can't just say something's incorrect without being able to prove so. I can say that, again, gravity is incorrect, but it doesn't mean anything unless I have proof. But if he is incorrect, and you have the proof, then what exactly is stopping you from, grabbing a microphone, even just your phone? Most people have phones, most phones have microphones nowadays, recording a bunch of stuff explaining why he's wrong. And in that case, you'd want him to speak, because he's going to come out and, say all this off-the-wall stuff that's totally wrong, and you can rip him to pieces that way. The problem is, this idea that if someone is wrong, you can prove them wrong, and it's really easy to do so nowadays with the internet and phones and technology and all that stuff, it doesn't marry up with censorship. Because if someone's wrong and you can prove them wrong, why do you need to censor them? You should actually give them the biggest microphone in the world, hook it up to some crazy speaker system, and let them make an absolute fool out of themselves, giving you even more fodder to prove them wrong with. In my mind, when you want to censor someone, all you're doing is admitting a couple things. And these are not mutually exclusive. They can be, my ideas are shit, and I can't compete with, someone else's, let's say Milo's idea in a vacuum, therefore Milo has to be shut down in order for my ideas to win. This could also tie into your presentation. So you have a really good idea for shredding Milo Yiannopoulus, brilliant, sound, valid, all that good stuff, but you stutter over the microphone and no one cares. Well, if you censor Milo, then you don't even have to bother making a fool of yourself trying to disprove him. And lastly, and I put this one out a little tentatively because I don't really know if it's true, strictly speaking it's just a hunch, but honestly, some censorship lovers might be just fucking lazy, and they don't have the effort to go out and do things themselves. They just want big daddy government to do it for them. We have this culture of instant gratification, anytime you want food, you've got food, for most people. Anytime you want sex, you got porn in seconds. So, if you picture this, you can be satisfied greatly at any time. Wouldn't it be absolutely grating to have to sit through someone like Milo speak and talk about stuff that you disagree with? It would be horrible because you can't just, well, you can just turn it off, but the mere idea that it is here upsets people. And this ties into our, culture, unfortunately, that is devolving into echo chambers. People self-censor and they don't want to talk to people who they disagree with. Facebook, social media in general, very good at this. It's very good at finding out what you like and making sure that you never hear anything contrary. And that's very good for social media's bottom line, essentially, because if, you got some sensitive person who is used to getting all their satisfactions instantaneously fulfilled, and they jump on Facebook and they can, get all this contradictory or confronting information, well, they might go, oh fuck, I hate Facebook, and jump off and not give Mark Zuckerberg that juicy data. So to me, censorship really indicates that your ideas are shitty and that you can't compete with people in a vacuum. Everyone who wants or doesn't want Milo Yiannopoulus to come here is basically just saying, hey, I can't out-debate this person. But at the same time, they'll ridicule him for how stupid his ideas are. They'll say, look at this, look at that, bring up stuff. But at the same time they don't want him to come here, which indicates to me that they can't do that. They can't disprove why pedophilia is great for young children or whatever off the wall shit he said. And that's pretty shameful. And of course, I do want to really strongly reiterate that this does send up a massive flare to groups like Antifa that they can use violence to achieve political silence of their opposition. I think there are reasons for this. It is, of course, as I mentioned several times, a very tense time for the current standing government. They're going into a really tough election. They've just had a leadership spill. They're certainly on the back foot. I think they're being, ironically enough, very conservative and not wanting to tread on anyone's toes in this manner. You know, ideally they'd stand on traditional Western values such as free speech, which, you know, potentially millions of people have died for in order to, you know, hand those freedoms to us. But, you know, a politician's job is really cushy and they get paid a shit ton, so they're probably thinking about that. Regardless, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thanks all for sticking around, and have a good one.